Today we're going to talk about the different types of governments that exist. All governments, in a sense, reflect their society's history and the culture, and all the societies must organize their governments to carry out important functions. Political scientists classify governments in a few different ways, according to how democratic they are and according to how the power is divided between the larger society, like a country, and a smaller part, like cities or counties, states, or provinces. But there are three main systems of government, and we're going to talk about them for a little while and explain the differences between. So the first system you have is called a unitary system, and this system is where all the government's power is at the national or central government, meaning that the central government creates all the laws and every other part has to support that law. Examples would be smaller countries like France and Japan. The advantage is, of course, it's a centralized power so that everybody's on the same page, but the disadvantage is there's less power at the local level. Think about a unitary system in the United States. The laws that the United States government would pass in a centralized location like Washington, D.C. are going to have a different effect than in Hawaii as they would in Alaska or Pennsylvania or Florida. So the system is made for smaller system states where the centralized power is going to create more stability for that area. The second system of the three types of major types of governments are a confederate system. And this is defined as a loose union of independent and sovereign states. Examples are the Federated States of Micronesia, sorry, I said that wrong. Advantages, the power is given to local states, meaning that the locality could create the laws, but the disadvantage is when there's a weak central power, the states determine their own budgets and solve their own problems. So is there really a need to have a centralized government, or can these states all survive as smaller countries in that sense? Obviously, when you have more people, you have more taxes and generation of revenue so that you can create a larger standing army or provide more social programs for your people. So a confederate system, again, loose, which means that there's more power at a local level and less power at the federal. Next is a federal system. This is dividing the power between the national and the state or the local governments. Examples are the United States and Brazil. The advantage is it's shared power with more centralized authority, but the disadvantage is each level can make different laws in different states. So the United States creates the Constitution, and all the laws from the federal government must be followed by the states. If not, there's going to be a lawsuit, and somehow federal funding could be cut for those states. In that sense, then all the states have to do is provide their own laws that are more specific as long as they do not violate the federal or national government's laws and regulations in the Constitution. So as we go on in prior knowledge, I want you to think back to the history of the United States, including back to the colonial history. What advantages did the federal system offer? Well, first of all, the states had sovereignty. They had popular sovereignty. They had the ability to rule and dictate themselves. It was necessary to obtain and ratify ratification of the Constitution, to create a strong central government, and more effective and efficient than it did under the Articles of Confederation, meaning that the states all had their powers, but there was a classic argument back and forth of whether the states should have more power than the central government, or the central government should have more power than the states. And this kind of argument was answered during the Civil War. When you think about the Civil War, when you think of prior knowledge of that, a lot of you hear about slavery, but in reality, what was the big underlying argument that was happening in our government was the federal government said that it wanted to have the power to either bring in slave states or not bring in slave states. And the slave states were mad because they said, each state should determine if it wants to be a slave state or a free state. And the national government disagreed and said the national government sets the laws, the states have to follow. So the Civil War was fought, and you see that right now our federal government has become the overarching power of our government, where the states have to pass laws that support the federal government. There's also things called constitutional government, and a constitution is a plan that provides the rule of government. It sets out the ideas that people are bound to, establishes basic structure such as power and duties, and it's the supreme law of the country. With our Constitution, that is literally the strongest piece of a law that we have, and everything that follows must support, or else you'll find yourself in court all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States to challenge laws. But again, the Constitution is the supreme law of our land. Other types of government, before we get into specifics: authoritarian, it controls all aspects of citizens' economic, political, and social lives. And in that aspect, we talk about Russia. We'll talk about these in a little bit more detail later. But the government tells you what you have to do, how you have to do it, and when you have to do it. You also have a totalitarian system, and that's a system of government where the government has total control. The example of that would be Nazi Germany, where you didn't even have the rights. You could just be rounded up, put into a work camp or concentration camp for no reason whatsoever, because the government said so. You also have a dictatorship where one person is in control. An example of that is North Korea, Kim Jong-il. They have one person who's able to create all the laws and all of our history. Our current president has met with Kim Jong-un, or Kim Jong-il, and to say, what aspects does he have to be able to protect his people? And in reality, we'll talk about that later, because North Korea is extremely poor as it comes to. The other idea is oligarchy. It's a small group of total control, and that's Vietnam and the Soviet Union as well, where a small group had the control to say what was happening when it was happening. You have a monarchy, where a king or queen or emperor exercises supreme law of the government. Ceremonial in most places in modern times, meaning that we don't see a lot of kings and queens that have actual political power or creating laws. Democratic is a government in which the people rule, where we are able to vote for people, and they represent us in a social way. Republic is a government in which voters hold sovereign power. Elected representatives are responsible to the people and exercise that power. So you could see that when you look at the United States, we are going to be mostly considered a democratic republic, because we have the government, which us, the people, who are rule, but we are also led through popular sovereignty, or the will of the people, to exercise that power. So I want to ask a question before we get on to the next part. Why would a direct democracy not be practical for the United States? That's going to be our discussion in the further lesson. So why would a direct democracy not be practical for the entire United States?